You guys know that clip from Harry Potter where Hermione's like, it's just a bit of light reading.
I checked this out weeks ago, forbidden light reading.
This is light.
Basically, if you choose to read Manufacturing Consent in your free time, you're basically Hermione. Alright. It's not that tough to read. But in terms of the way it's written, Manufacturing Consent explains complex topics in a way that most people can understand pretty easily. And the authors, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, go out of their way to explain all of their points and concepts in great detail, more detail than I think anyone could ask for. That said, this book is not light. The vocabulary in this book are probably pretty high school level words a lot of times. Same with the concepts, definitely adult concepts and topics. All that said, all that out of the way, I think everyone should read this book. In a previous video, I had mentioned the Mandela Effect, which refers to Nelson Mandela in South Africa. The Mandela Effect is basically where the authoritarian South African government banned Mandela's picture, saying his name, writing his name, publishing his name, everything like that. But everyone in South Africa knew who Nelson Mandela was, knew what he's fighting for. So, what does that tell us? In terms of free speech and trying to suppress ideas, maybe that super authoritarian approach is not the best way to do it, because the Mandela effect, the more you actively try to hide something and so obviously try to hide something, the more people are curious about it and the more they find out. Now, in the United States, which is what this book basically covers, is United States media, we pretty much have the most open free speech laws. There's like the idea of something like suppressing Nelson Mandela's name or like suppressing Donald Trump's name or Hillary Clinton's name is just totally insane. Actually, this book was written in '89, so it would be like the idea of suppressing like George Bush's name or Bill Clinton's name or Ronald Reagan's name. Like, that's insane. No one would ever even consider proposing that in our government. But like what we know from the Mandela effect, it's probably not good to propose that. If you want to get your own worldview, ideology, opinion, basically whatever you want to get out into the world, the best way to do that is not the authoritarian way. The best way to do that is actually outlined in detail in this book. In the first chapter, you are introduced to the propaganda model. And what is the propaganda model? Well, it's basically this book's theory of how the media is controlled by the government and large corporations. The propaganda model is broken down into 5 filters, which I will try to go over briefly now. Number 1, concentrated ownership. Right now, 90% of the media, which I mean all media, not just news media, so I'm talking music, magazine, books, like fantasy books, TV, movies, and news media as well, is controlled by 6 companies. So 90% of the media, 6 companies. And it wasn't always like this. So in 1983, it said 50 companies owned 90% of the media. So that's way more, much more of a free market, obviously much better. But before even 1983, the media was even more fragmented. This book was written in '89, but there's a new introduction to this book, which was written in like 2000 or 2002 or something. And at that time, 9 companies owned 50% of the media. So it's kind of been inching to where we are today, where 6 companies do own 90% of the media, and it's pretty tough to actually get it so that less than 6 companies do own 90% of the media. This video from Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns basically all local TV stations throughout the country, made all their TV stations say the same thing, which led to this viral video of all these TV stations saying the same thing.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about trouble-bringing irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
the sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these things simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. Filter number 2, advertising. So this is kind of a touchy subject to bring up to a TV anchor. I've actually seen it brought up to like Brian Seltzer on CNN, and he responds with, well, I mean, I don't know who's advertising on my show right now. I don't watch the ads. And I believe that's true. I believe he doesn't watch the ads or know who's advertising. However, that doesn't mean that advertisers don't have a massive effect on content. There was an example in the book, actually, where basically there's 2 newspapers in a city. Let's call it newspaper A and newspaper B. And newspaper A had a very good message for advertisers, particularly large corporate advertisers. So they were able to attract more advertisers and charge more money for advertisements, whereas newspaper B was more in favor of labor and workers, but that wasn't something that the big corporations liked at the time. So they got less good advertisements, and they got less money, they expanded less quickly, and eventually they went out of business, I believe. But, I mean, if they didn't go out of business, they would have to either... They would basically have to talk to the advertisers and say, hey, like, what would you be willing to advertise on? And they might say, well, we don't like this writer, or we don't like these type of stories, or, something that very clearly affects the content of the news coverage. Number 3, sources. So this was actually by far the most shocking part to me, because I had heard of all like these filters before. I hadn't heard it like laid out in such a long form way, but I mean, this wasn't like the first time I was hearing about a lot of these concepts, but the examples given in chapter 1.3 about sources were by far like they just floored me. I was so shocked. It starts by going over the Air Force's media output over the course of 2 years, the only 2 years that they actually published this information, but it said there were 690,000 copies of 140 newspapers a week, and also 125,000 magazines a month, 34 radio shows, 17 TV stations. Those were overseas mostly. 45,000 headquarters and unit news releases, so those were probably for like military bases. 615,000 hometown news releases, 6,600 interviews, 3,200 press conferences, 500 news media orientation flights, 11,000 speeches. Also in 1968, the Air Force had 1,305 full-time PR employees. So, oh my gosh, it's just so much. And keep in mind, this is just the Air Force we're talking about. So, I'm sure probably the Navy spends even more than this, more time and money, I would guess. Maybe not. Maybe don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe the Army spends more. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe the CIA spends more. Maybe not. I don't know. The CIA and Pentagon budgets are notoriously massive and never audited, so we don't really know. I would be very interested to see what these numbers are at now. Number 4, FLAC, which is the negative response to media statements or media programs or articles or whatever. And that negative response is either by the government or by large corporations. So in the book, there's an example from like the 80s of CBS getting sued in a libel suit by a coal company for $120 million. Don't worry about whether or not it was libel. Just think about the concept, like, of that sort of accountability, right? Now, think about, would it be possible for Vietnamese civilians or Sandinistas in Central America to put together even like a $500,000 lawsuit, libel lawsuit, towards a media organization? Of course they can. So basically what I'm saying is there are certain classes of people and certain groups of people where you could basically say whatever you want about, and there's very little accountability. And then there are certain groups where if you say something about them, you better be sure you're right, or else there'll be a massive libel suit. The government can also be a pretty large pusher of flack towards journalists or media organizations. They can take away access. And sometimes the media can push back. So like when the White House revoked Jim Acosta's press credentials, obviously that shouldn't happen. And the media kind of rallied around CNN and Jim Acosta, and it was great because he got his press credentials back, I believe, after like a week or something, which they definitely shouldn't have been taken away. That was like the most high profile of cases. A lot of times, this is kind of more behind the scenes stuff that happens where you have a source in the White House. If you report in such a way that that source likes, you will get more access to that source and therefore have more access to write better articles. But if you don't report in a way that your source likes, well, then they'll be like, F you, I'm not talking to you. The 5th filter is an anti-communist filter, or that's how it's presented in the book. And 3 decades ago, that might have been right, but thanks to the work of people like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert to some extent as well, they made that sort of attack, like the Sean Hannity type of attack of just calling everyone communist all the time, regardless of whether or not what they're proposing is communist. Obama's very clearly not a communist, so that's openly mocked now. But 3 decades ago, it wasn't really like that, and there was a lot of like Red Scare narratives where you could call someone communist. There definitely still is an ideological filter, but it's framed in a different way now. And sometimes this ideological filter can be good. So, like, for example, how many openly fascist hosts does CNN have? 0, right? But, like, obviously that makes sense because a very small percentage of the country defines themselves openly as fascists. But, like, same still with socialists. Socialist is a bit more weird, though, especially for someone my age, where, you know, half the people my age, according to polls, have a favorable view of socialism. So it's very weird when, like, the New York Times has, like, 0 or 1 socialist writer. I don't know if you want to consider Jamal Bowie a socialist or not, but it's certainly, like, 1% of their writers. Like, no more than that are socialists. It's definitely ideological in terms of the economy as well, in terms of what the media talks about. And I think Greta Thunberg, or however you say her name, but like the 16-year-old climate activist from Sweden, put it pretty darn well. She was talking about how climate change is always ignored, but she also synthesized that with what isn't ignored, and she used the line, the fairy tales of endless economic growth. And that is what they choose to talk about instead of climate change. Like, constantly. There's almost never any talk about climate change, and the economic growth angle is favored, like, exclusively. So yeah, that's what a propaganda model is, and basically the 5 media filters. This book is actually only 7 chapters, and that was chapter 1 that I just outlined, basically. Chapter 2 is Worthy and Unworthy Victims, and it compares the murder of a priest in Poland to the murder of a priest in, was it Guatemala or Nicaragua? One of the Central American countries, and it talks about how the media was outraged by the killing of the priest in Poland because they could blame the Russians. And basically, he's a worthy victim because it fits into a broader narrative of, like, Soviets are bad, and, like, here's why they're bad. They murdered this priest. But then in Central America, it was kind of like role reversal because the priest was murdered by U.S.-backed right-wing radical militant groups. And it goes through that, and he's basically an unworthy victim. Even though the priest was talked about, but these military groups obviously slaughtered thousands of innocent people for no reason. They just terrorized everyone. So, like, all those people who died were unworthy victims because, you know, like, they're being killed by U.S.-backed right-wing radical forces. Obviously, the U.S. isn't going to be outraged by it in terms of the government. Corporations aren't going to be outraged by it. So the media won't cover it. That's the way it is. And I mean, you can think about unworthy victims in so many contexts. Like, think about the civil rights protests, for example, in the 60s. So basically, the college students in the 60s, regardless of their race, were like, yeah, like, Jim Crow laws are just insane. They stood basically full solidarity with Martin Luther King and his whole agenda and message and equality and stuff. You know, the early hippies. And so these protests were going on with mostly black people, and there would be just horrible, horrific police brutality committed against these black civil rights protesters. So their strategy actually ended up being, hey, we've got a bunch of these white college natural allies, so we're just going to bust them in to our protests, and that'll get more media attention. And because white people were at the time, I mean, like, racism was alive and well, and like you could be an open racist at the time, basically, and like, you know, Strom Thurmond, or, you know, pick your senator from the South. They were probably a racist openly. But like, if you're a mother or father who's white with a position of power, or like relative power, maybe you're like the VP of some like decently large company, and your son or daughter goes to a protest and just gets brutalized by police, well, now they're a worthy victim, because whereas if you were just like a poor black person in the South, to the media, in the eyes of the media, you were unworthy. They wouldn't dedicate time to you. And that's the way it was, and it was horrible. And it took like this horrible, like, just horrific brutalization of people trying to cross that bridge in Alabama for a lot of the media and people to actually be like, well, you know, this is really getting out of hand. We need to stop this. And, you know, there was less brutality after that, but obviously police brutality is still a massive problem in the African American community in particular. But even just generally towards groups with less power, it's problematic. Oh my God, I feel like I have to talk about everything in here because it's so important, but also relating it to things that are currently happening is also extremely important. So like, I never know what to talk about here. Chapter 3 is legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections, featuring El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Oh my God, my Spanish accent is just horrible. It's just like, yes, El Salvador. But yeah, that chapter 3 on those elections and comparing them was also incredibly insightful. Chapter 4 was about the attempted assassination of the Pope in the 80s, which I had known nothing about. I didn't even know that there was like an attempt on the Pope's life, because obviously I wasn't born then, and there was a lot of historical value in here as well, for me especially, because all these events in this book happened before I was born. There were a lot of interesting tables that outline the points very well. I love graphics. Just anything, any visual aid in a book, I'm just a huge fan of. Any chart, anything like that. I'm not a huge fan of like the textbook writing style that this is in. However, I totally and completely understand, because if it wasn't laid out in such a precise and clear way, the media would have a field day with this book. They want to try to find any possible way to discredit this. Instead of it being discredited, it was mostly ignored by the mass media, although it did hit the New York Times bestseller list, which was interesting, which is also why I think it was written in a very like well-written way, just because it was so accessible, even though it was complex subjects that people had never really thought about before, or not, they hadn't thought deeply about, certainly. Think about if society just knew addition and subtraction, and no multiplication, no division, and certainly no like algebra, but you wrote a book that had a wide-reaching audience, and it taught everyone the basics of multiplication and division. That would be a wild success. That's where I think we are as a society when it comes to media criticism. We are like at a second or third grade level. And I think we were even at like a way more rudimentary level before this book. I think this book brought us up like 2 grade levels as a society in terms of critical thinking when it comes to media. And it's not to say things have gotten better since this book, because in terms of the media itself, because there's been more consolidation, that's bad. Cable news didn't exist really when this book was written, but now cable news does exist, and it's like they're the most egregious abusers of the propaganda model. I think this might be like the most important book ever written. I would not be opposed to everyone in like their senior year of high school taking, a class on this book where everyone reads this book, and you talk about it, you give examples, and you write a paper, and that's it. It sounds like more of a college class, like, than a high school class, but, I think it would be a great high school class. I think as a society, we would be in a much better position if people understood the media better. And again, like, our level of understanding of the media is not high enough as a society. And it leads to, like, just these horrible, media criticisms, and it allows for, the Jewish conspiracy, right? Like, that's like the cliche, insane, unhinged media criticism. But, like, I think people wouldn't fall for that if we had a higher wisdom as a society, maybe, or higher intelligence. I don't know. We were more savvy when it comes to media criticism and understanding the media. And yeah, I mean, I could talk about this all day. I really could. But this video is probably like very long already, so I will end it here. Read this book. Not kidding, most important book ever written. Full stop. Like, comment, subscribe. Bye.